Welcome to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered with Perry Clark. This program looks at mental health from unique perspectives and shows you how to manage your life by finding the knots that help you and stay away from the ones that could be a disadvantage. Now, here is your host, Perry Clark.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. This is Perry Clark, your licensed marriage and family therapist, here with you. And I want to start reminding everyone that this is an educational and entertainment podcast. This does not constitute a session with an actual therapist or mental health professional. I strongly recommend seeking one out in your area to work on your unique issues. So, as you've been hearing on a few of my other episodes, we're talking about my experiences from Comic-Con. And our guest today is another of the people I sat on a panel with, and we had a conversation with about the joys of our, not just our geekdom, but what we do as fellow mental health advocates and out in the world supporting those around us. So I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Elizabeth Smith. Dr. Smith is a licensed clinical psychologist based out of Chicago who speaks and is conversational in Korean. Her mother is Korean and her father is a disabled U.S. Army veteran. She was born abroad and moved to the States in her childhood with several relocations and neurodiversity presentations in her multilingual family. Her training in psychology began early on. Dr. Smith earned her master's in doctoral clinical psychology at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology and is currently licensed in both Illinois and Indiana, as well as having the interjurisdictional ability to provide telehealth in over 30 states, participating in the Psy-D. She provides care through a relational, collaborative, neurodivergent, affirming social justice and trauma-informed lens. In addition to providing therapy, neuropsychological assessments, she utilizes evidence-based trauma treatments such as EMDR, along with play therapy, expressive arts, geek therapy, and honors ancestral healing practices. Dr. Smith is also part of APA's accrediting training team, supervising emerging psychologists with a passion for supporting their work with cultural and neurologically diverse individuals. Dr. Smith has also enjoys volunteering, not engineering, with nonprofits such as AMHC. I'll let her tell you what these abbreviations mean. KAW, and co-founder of the NAAAP Chicago Wellness Program. She has spoken nationally on panels such as C2E2, WonderCon, and of course, San Diego Comiccon to advocate for diversity in media, access to health, and to the use of pop culture in therapy. In addition, Dr. Smith enjoys culinary adventures, joyful body movements, art, comics, cosplay, gaming, collecting Hello Kitty and Tamagotchi, and her training her pandemic puppy, who is currently in track for a therapy dog certificate. So, Dr. Elizabeth, welcome to Untying Knots. Or sorry, Dr. Smith, welcome to Untying Knots.
Thank you for that warm welcome. And wow, you read the whole thing.
Well, nearly. I did skip a section.
Okay. Introductions are so funny sometimes. It's like, what part of yourself do you talk about?
Mm-hmm.
I find that sometimes so fascinating. So thank you for having me. Thank you for introducing, and very excited to be here.
It's a joy to have you. So let's start with our first question. How did you get here?
So it's a great question. I know that on the panel we talked about a variety of things, including my interest in comics as a child, and how I have an older brother and my father who was often stationed abroad, and how my brother and I used to read comics, and we used to pretend that our dad was a superhero flying around and that he would come home safely because he had superpowers, and that our uncles would also come home safely. And of course, there were lots of really great TV shows on at the time, back when Jim Lee's X-Men was on, and Wildcats, and
oh God, there's one I haven't thought about them in a while. Wildcats.
oh yeah, oh yeah. So there was definitely a lot of opportunity for us to engage in our fantasy life in that way. And one thing I did not share is that post my parents' separation, we lived mostly with my mom's side of the family, who had different ideas about gender roles and what was appropriate for little girls. And I was the oldest granddaughter on my mom's side. So it was very much expected for me to take on certain roles in the family. And comics were not really a part of that, which of course made them that much more appealing to me. So a lot of fantasy components very, very much played a big, big part in my upbringing. In addition, my dad being a Trekkie and very, very into the Sci-Fi Channel, very much played a part in that portion of my life and helped me get through so many different aspects of difficulty and growing up and learning who I am and learning about other people. And I think that had a very big part of that part of me, I guess, exploring different aspects of how do we understand people? How do we, explore new areas?
Well, yeah, because so I apologize for interrupting you. So as you said, being Trekkie, immediately think about Spock and the whole aspect of half human, half Vulcan, and we know what the Vulcan side brings, and we get to see him struggling with his human side. And something made me think about, wait a minute, Deanna was also half human, half Betazoid, but we never got to see a struggle between her human and Betazoid side. They seem to be always functioning together.
We definitely saw some interesting components with her mom.
Right.
And with the Betazoid marital customs and things, for sure. I think if we're talking about some more of the cultural components that were navigated, Worf was a really wonderful person representation. Character, yeah. Morph was great, fantastic as well. In some ways, almost another great representation of what it's like to essentially be like a diaspora person, character, not really within their own homeland. Those were, just such fantastic characters in so many ways. Absolutely.
My apologies for segueing us, but there's also that moment where it's like, there's those points where we all can find an element of these characters in our own lives. And as you're talking about this aspect of what happened with the idea of what fits in the Korean family, it suddenly makes me think, it's like, oh yeah, Diana kind of fits that experience with the expectations of her Betazoid culture's expectations. Same with Worf.
For sure. Absolutely. I'm getting the feel, and this could be off, but is TNG your favorite of the Star Trek?
I wouldn't say it's, well, I'm a Trekkie, so I watch all of them. I watch all of them. Believe me, I watch all of them. TNG was the one that I got to watch as it was for as a kid, because I grew up on the syndication of the original series. And so watching all of TNG, watching all of DS9, watching Voyager, watching Enterprise, now watching Discovery, Picard, and Strange New Worlds. Yeah. And Lower Decks and Prodigy. So I'm watching all of them.
Fantastic. Including the animated series, of course, right?
Yeah, both Lower Decks and Prodigy. I admit that I probably haven't watched as many of the classic animated ones, but
they're all so great in so many different ways. And I think when that question of, how did you get here? When it comes to, studying psychology or studying people and having capacity for that, I think there's so many different experiences that we can point to, and media that we were consuming at the time definitely has a huge part in that. But then there's also that question of, why did it matter to us so much?
And in some ways it was that escape,
Yeah,
or that place that we found some sort of similarity that we weren't finding elsewhere.
connection, belonging. Yeah, absolutely.
And especially when we then bring in the neurodiversity components of this too.
Yeah. We did our panel at the Central Library, and they had these really beautiful quotes at the top. And at one point I was thinking, oh, I got to make sure that I point that out. And of course I forgot in all of
so much going on.
There was, but there was this beautiful quote, and it said, we read so that we know we're not alone. I think was the quote. I might be paraphrasing a little bit, but it was a very meaningful, especially when we were talking about our specific topic of how media, how comics, art, pop culture can be so helpful for BIPOC students. And I was thinking, wow, for so many people who have felt othered or felt like they were being told who they were in ways that didn't match, how important is that, to know that you're not alone?
And especially when you're around people who are theoretically supposed to be not making you feel alone, but you do, because there's some other components of our intersectional identities that don't match with them.
Absolutely. Yeah. So when you ask people that question of how did they get here, what is your typical answer?
Oh, my answer? As I said when I started this podcast, it's like, I'm not going to sit here and focus on me. You'll learn about me along the way.
Yeah. I think it's such a universal pondering, what is our origin story? And I think it's a wonderful projective in a lot of ways too, because that can shift depending on where we are in our reflective processes.
And what we're maybe needing to overcome.
Absolutely. And I think because I had already had a bit of a conversation about, like what sparked my interest in comics and psychology and being around people and, various different components just from the people and environments that I was exposed to moving around a bit, being in a military family, being in a multicultural family in a lot of ways, and seeing a lot of different interactions. I think that was like naturally where I went. But I wonder how I would have answered that had we, just just met each other.
Yeah, it's different when you're doing that first introduction versus having that time and so forth, which is another reason why I wanted you to offer the aspect for you to come onto the podcast. It's something where there is a lot of that's that deeper story, because as you've just been talking about the Korean side of your family and such, and those dynamics, again, not a very common thing that we get to hear. And that's a beauty of the diversity. And as I've always said, this is a BIPOC. It's people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color. I know there are some that just want us to get caught up in that name, and that gets into identity politics. But this is the diversity, and we have a diversity of faith in all of our geekdom as well, which was so illustrated being at Comic-Con. showing so many different fandoms, all being present, all getting along, all being enjoyed, new people finding other fandoms that they can now be a part of. It's not like you lost anything by finding that connection. Because as you're also talking about it, I'm suddenly thinking about there was a recent horror movie that came out in this last year with Sandra Oh that was Korean centered. I think it was called Uma.
Oma
Yeah.
means mother.
Right. And I hadn't watched it, but it's like I noted it's like, because there's also that notion, and I've been noticing this in the last probably 5-10 years, that a lot more horror movies were now going up into Asia and such to pull stories from for horror. But of course, they usually always had a white protagonist.
I think if we look at some of the evolution of horror in the US, there's definitely been a movement from this like visual monster. And throughout several years, it's gone more into it's a everyday person to even more humanized, right? So there was like a phase that even went to zombies. Right? Like it became more human, and the things that we're becoming more and more scared of tend to be things including mental illness related things, which for me brings up a lot of things I'm not such a big fan of. And I know that sometimes people don't like, they have certain kinds of horror things or fandoms that they're very attached to. I'm not a fan of the propagation of certain stigmas. And I think when there's a horror film that's set in some sort of psychiatric ward,
one of the classics.
Yeah. Or, right, there are horror games, of course. And they choose this as a setting. I think it definitely propagates some things that make it harder for people to really acknowledge and, you know, find that connection in a way where they can bring peace to a lot of our experiences that could be normalized a bit differently. I do find it really wonderful that even when it comes to Disney films lately, it's not so much that, oh, there's this villain of like a dragon that has to be defeated. Or, and you know, the stepmother trope, I think, has gone away a bit. But now we're like really talking about intergenerational traumas.
Such in Kanto.
Yes. You know, for Turning Red, when we're thinking of, you know, a lot of different films, we're moving away and we're getting a little bit, I think, and I'm not sure which words to use to describe it, but we're hitting closer to home, I think, in some ways.
Well, yeah. Well, and I think there's also some of the resistance you're seeing too, who are so used to that we need the identifiable bad guy or the identifiable monster to be able to have an understanding and say that it's a great movie. Because I mean, last night I just was watching Nope, which not going to give any spoils, not going to give any spoilers on it, but it's like the monster, or it's about alien abduction and aliens involved, but it's not exactly what you think it's going to be when it comes to the alien.
You know, I didn't even know that much. I didn't even know that, you know, going into the movie. But what I do agree that a lot of times, you know, there's a totally different kind of commentary. And I think that's part of what Star Trek did so well. I think that's part of what X-Men did so well, right? Is that we're not just talking about mutants or aliens. Uh, but we're using that as a vehicle to facilitate this other kind of discussion that maybe, just maybe you're ready for it. Let's see.
Right. Which is sort of gets into the controversy. Someone's saying it's like, oh, Star Trek is suddenly being woke. It's like it's always been woke.
Yeah.
Star Wars has actually always been woke.
Yeah.
Starship Troopers was actually always woke, talking about propagandism.
Oh, yeah.
So
well, I'm not quite even sure if I like the terminology of woke, because it also inherently involves a binary.
It's you're either awake or not.
Yeah. And I think that there can be a continuous process of awakening, just like there's this continuous process of growth.
Yeah, I've stopped using the whole woke term a long time ago when I had somebody who says, well, I figured because you're on here, you're woke, so you'd understand. It's like, okay, I'm noticing you're quote unquote woke, and I'm giving air quotes here, on issues that matter to you, not on all these other things. So you're going to be quote unquote woke, air quotes again. You need to be woke about a bunch of things, not just the stuff that only matters to you.
Very, very true in so many ways. And I think that's part of the beauty of intersectionality in a lot of you. I think, even when it came to, being asked to help out with a panel, my first instinct sometimes is to not gravitate towards BIPOC panels. I sometimes, I'm like, well, BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous People of Color. And I'm pale. Right? And so that gives me a different kind of privilege. And I don't know sometimes how is it for me to be there? And yes, there are definitely, right, aspects to colorism and things that are involved with this. But there's also a part of me that's like, would it possibly be more meaningful for someone else to see? Right? And so there are definitely times where I think, as we, consider, what's meaningful to us, but also what's meaningful to others. And I think sometimes it's also a piece of like, who's at the table, who's not.
Right.
What are, my particular kinds of privilege? And education's definitely one of them. Being, white adjacent, I have an American name. My American name, Elizabeth, comes from my dad's side. His mother is Faith Elizabeth. So they wanted to name me Faith, but my parents did not share a religious faith. So that was a bit controversial. And, my Korean name, Pangshi, comes from my mother's mother, who named me. And old school Koreans are delighted with that name. Most other people are like, is that really your name? Because it's not very common. And, at the same time, I mean, it's kind of like an old school name, but I don't have to go by my Korean name. That's actually something that happens, is most people that come from outside of the US, in a lot of Asian cultures, we have more than one name because we'll choose, and it's not a translation. It's not like Peter to Piedra, right? Like it's a completely different name. It's like, oh, Linda, I'll go by that. Like, right. It's a very different thing. But, having a white passing name, right? Like an American passing name, and being able to switch our accents, which my mother cannot do.
Right.
I can lessen, and sometimes depending on how I'm feeling, different pronunciations, the accents come out. But those are also some aspects of things, to really consider too, when we're thinking about a lot of, these pieces of what matters to us. And, not everyone recognizes what those experiences are like, especially also like within communities too. Like who's considered Asian? Or, right, like who's considered in any, racial grouping, there's within group types of things. So sometimes it is about like listening and hearing all of those stories and considering also, how do our experiences and our struggles match or not match with others? And it's not a monolith by any means.
No, it's not. And actually, Mark Nazala and I were just talking about that in his interview as well, about names and uses of names and what it represents and why they used it, and some of the aspects of people anglicizing their name too. So there's so much power in the names. And thank you, Ursula K. Le Guin. Wizards of Earth Seas very much talks about the powers of names.
Yeah. In a bit. And I think I mentioned this, that my partner's name, his last name is Han. And should I take his name, I will be Dr. Han. And Han is a culture-bound term in Korea.
Right.
It's after years and years of oppression and so many different occupations and things that have happened. Han is like anger. It's such a, like live in our blood.
Right.
It has multiple nuances to it. It's not as simple just to say, oh, it's anger, but it's also a sense of hope and things. But I joke, to simplify it, that soon my name will be Dr. Anger. And that it sounds more like a totally different origin story, like the origin story of the villain.
Yeah. Yeah. Although, I think, do you ever see Mystery Men?
Yes.
And Ben Stiller's character was Mr. Anger.
Yes. He's on my list of people that I think would be super fun to hang out with for a day. I think there are so many people that you could learn so much from and have like a lot of fun with. And he's on my list of people that I think, just if there was like a contest to hang out.
That would be one you wanted to be in. But yeah.
Amazing. I think he'd be fun in various different types of settings too. Yeah. But I don't know. And I think possibly most people have a list of people that they would love to like have a meal with or spend the day with, and what that potentially would look like.
But ultimately, that aspect is, I'm curious, what are you right now in the process have settled on whether you're going to go as Dr. Anger or stay as Dr. Smith, which for some, I started laughing when we were at dinner during Comic-Con when I was immediately thinking of Lost in Space.
Dr. Smith. So the Smith side, as it's a very Irish side, and not a lot of people realize this, but my uncle, so my dad's dad, my paternal grandfather, his brother's name is Peter Smith, and one of them. One of his siblings is Peter Smith, and one of his siblings is Peggy.
Mm-hmm.
And in particular, Peter is very, very well known in the world of Irish step dancing.
Mm.
So he's now my late uncle, but he is credited a lot for how Irish step dance is now taught in the US,
Mm-hmm.
as well as the judges and, a variety of things that because our family wasn't near his school
Mm-hmm.
and like in that area to learn Irish step dance, I never really took part in that. But it is like one of those interesting things of, the Smith name like really connects me to this like line of people in this culture that I don't really feel as connected to, especially because I live with my mom's side so much. So I don't know. I don't know how I feel sometimes about the name change also because names are so important. And Smith seems so generic in so many ways. It also has so much meaning and connection on that other side.
I'm wondering if there's a possibility of either hyphenating or maybe it's time to create a new last name, the Angry Smith.
The Angry Smith. I've joked about that too. And because I'm like, so if it's hyphenated, which one comes first? And I'm like, Smith Han or Hans Smith? And I was like, Hans Smith sounds German. and I'm like, wow, okay. Technically, that's where I was born. So it's an interesting thing to think about, names. And ultimately, I think another piece of this, though, and people often ask, with a name like Elizabeth and with having more than one name, I often get asked, well, what are you usually called? Or is it okay if I call you this? Or how do you prefer? And honestly, growing up, I've had so many different pronunciations from Elizabeth, Elizabeth, Lygia. I've had American versions like Betty. And honestly, if I knew someone was talking about like trying to address me, right? Like if they were talking about something and they were trying to address me, then I would answer just the same as if you said something in English or you said it in Korean. If I knew what you were trying to say, it wasn't so much of like, oh, I need to correct you or like, oh, it needs to be this, because I think regardless of what I was called, I always, I guess, had an idea of who I am regardless. And like, I have an idea of, which beverage you're referring to, regardless of how you call it. Are you calling it a Coke, Coca-Cola, a pop, a soda? Like, okay. I know what you're talking about. So to me, it was less maybe about that. And so maybe even now when I think about it, I think I'm okay either way. And in a lot of ways, like the name doesn't really necessarily change me.
No.
Yeah.
Because it's ultimately the name you feel comfortable being in the world with, despite, again, all the identity politics that gets smashed into all of this.
Oh, paperwork.
That too. And that's a great place for a break. So stay tuned, folks, for our second half as we continue to talk here with Dr. Elizabeth Smith, or Hung. So the Angry Smith.
The Angry Smith. It'll be like a Kosuko.
Hey, not bad. He did become emperor. And I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage family therapist. So stay tuned and we'll have more to laugh about and consider and ponder in this next half. So be back short, folks.
Our lives and the world around us can get messy and frustrating. Untangle and Grow Counseling's focus is to untangle that mess and make sense of it. so you have a good foundation to build and grow from. Visit us on the web at untangleandgrowcounseling.com. Perry Clark offers individual psychotherapy, couples and family therapy, and adolescence therapy from a variety of coping materials and resources. Visit untangleandgrowcounseling.com for more information. You are listening to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. If you have a question or comment about our podcast, send an email to pclark@untyingknotspodcast.com. That's pclark@untyingknotspodcast.com. And now, back to the program.
Hello, all. Welcome back for our second half here on Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist, here with Dr. Elizabeth Smith. How you doing?
Great. I think we had a great chat during the break.
Yeah, even so that we took a longer break than I thought we normally would. And I know it's late where you are, so I want to also make sure we respect your time more. So as we get into this next section, I know there are some of the things that I didn't know what the abbreviations were in your bio, and I think it was the AMHC. So what does that stand for?
The Asian Mental Health Collective, I believe, was mentioned. The Korean American Wellness Association, and NAP stands for the National Association of Asian American Professionals, the Chicago chapter as well. I volunteered with a variety of different nonprofits. With the Asian Mental Health Collective, I've done things such as support groups for Asian Americans online, as well as their Lotus Fund, which is a wonderful grant where they actually pay for 25 people to get 8 free therapy sessions. Asian mental health provider. So I'm one of the providers. With NAP, which is also another one that I predominantly volunteer with. I helped them found a wellness program that does monthly events, as well as some additional things to help with awareness and self-care for Asian American professionals, to help us pause and normalize aspects of wellness.
Right. So, and the time this is will probably be airing, which is going to be in November. I'm sure most people probably have missed the recent John Oliver late night this week show where he talked about mental health care. And one of the things very much you've highlighted in that, which has also been known by us in the field, is that the demand has, thanks to everything that's happened in the last several years, the demand for mental health services has just skyrocketed. But the number of us who are capable of doing it and doing it efficiently has either shrank or has not grown very much. And even more so as therapists that are BIPOC, not to mention adding in the geek factor of it. So, I mean, what are your thoughts about all of that?
It's so very true, and it's difficult. It is a very white-dominated field. It's very colonized in many ways of even how psychology is taught. And so there's a lot that we have to unlearn as we are, and learn, of course, as we are working in the field. It's hard in so many ways. And I don't think it really fully clicked for me until I was several years into practice. That, wow, there really aren't that many Asian practitioners. And for psychologists, I think it's 4% are Asian American. And we also have to keep in mind how many of those are actually practicing versus how many are doing research, only doing research, or how many are maybe teaching and not necessarily doing the therapy or the assessment components. And so there's definitely more diversity in master's level clinicians.
Which is what I am.
Which is so important in so many ways. And then we get into the hierarchical component within the field. So, right, because there's always out-group and in-group stuff. And that is such a hard thing in so many ways, because even with things like a CE, for instance, it might not necessarily be something that, it can be such wonderful and rich information, but it could be something that somebody doesn't attend because they're not getting whatever credit for it or something.
I know that problem very well. It's a very consistent one that keeps coming up with the BIPOC brain spotting trainings, which I have become very much a part of, where a number of people don't want to spend their money if they're not going to get continuing education requirement credits. But the BIPOC training is designed for BIPOC clinicians solely, which means, we're not exactly letting in white therapists because this is a counter, or should I say, it's meant to be a safer space, a braver space. And therefore, because we're not allowing them in, we don't get the CE credits. So to get this training, you're basically paying for it without that additional little benefit.
It is such a tough thing. And, I think it was 2021, I did another EMDR training, and it was specific to Asian American mental health practitioners. And I knew going in, this is, what it would be. But I don't think it sunk in for me until I looked around and had this like settling within my body that I had never really had in any other training, because I'm usually maybe one or two in the room. And there was this oddness to it, even in that setting. And so there's so many different components to it. And working at an APA accredited training site and a CE provider site, there are definitely various components to this. And obviously, we bring in ourselves, we bring in our interests, we bring in so many different lived experiences and wisdom. And when I train the students, what used to be called diversity seminar, which at one point was once a year, or the internship, or sometimes people call it a residency. In teaching the seminar and co-teaching it with another clinician, we've renamed it JEDI, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Training. And we bring in, just different elements to this. And there are so many different wonderful aspects to it. And, even being on the side of doing interviews and advocating for like which students, do we want to include or not include? And you can see differences in bias. You can see differences in how things work when you are on certain sides of these processes. And you can see how people are evaluated and things. And I am such a big proponent of supporting the students and bringing in more diversity, and, working with we need people with ADHD in the field. And yes, when somebody is looking for a practitioner, they're probably going to be looking for someone that is offering, that ability to empathize with them, right? Because we have that double empathy related difficulty of, people from different groups sometimes have a harder time communicating.
Exactly. And sometimes you want that occasional difference, because I know in my practice, I've had Vietnamese, Filipino, Middle Eastern,
Mhm.
so a couple of Latin clients, beyond just as well. Sorry, have to go through run through the Rolodex of clients. I've had at least two Polynesian
Mhm.
clients as well. So
Mhm.
yeah.
And I mean, I was going to say that I was working with one nonprofit where I was doing something else. It was like a healing circle, just community work. And
Mm-hmm.
there happened to be some art therapy students present.
Mm-hmm.
And they were so in awe. They're like, an Asian therapist? Oh my gosh. Like I've just I like their minds were so blown, and they spoke to me and told me about some of their experiences in their program, about how, they had a professor that told them that no one's going to want to work with them because they're Asian.
Ooh.
And, just like these experiences. And so we sat with this for a bit, and I told them something that I guess maybe some people might get upset with. But he's not necessarily wrong.
Mm-hmm.
This professor that told them that. But he's also not fully right? Like it's not necessarily
Mm-hmm.
binary. Because there are people, for instance, who won't want to work with someone who identifies with the gender of that
Mm-hmm.
therapist.
Mm-hmm.
And there are people that specifically want to work with that person because of their gender expression,
Mm-hmm.
because of their racial background. And there are going to be people that don't care.
Mm-hmm.
And there are going to be people that honestly just want help.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And they're going to hear that, hey, you were very helpful for someone else. So like, could you help me out?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's word of mouth. There's lots of different aspects to why someone will or won't want to work with you. And I think sometimes it is really difficult, especially when you're othered, to readily accept some things that people say, and we're going to hear it and think that there's not space for us.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, sometimes there is.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you have to make it. And sometimes, that idea of being rated and evaluated and all of those things,
Mm-hmm.
it's going to differ for each person. Like the fit is going to be different. Mm-hmm.
Which is one of the things that, especially from the geek world, it would be good to start seeing more psychologists of color or mental health workers of color in the genre as well, and depending on the genres. But I think this is a nice segue also into talking about the myths and realities of mental health. And one of the ones we were talking about, which I think this leads beautifully into, what do you think is one of those myths?
So, I mean, we were just talking about the rating system.
Mm-hmm.
is a huge myth in so many ways, in that.
And just to be clear, that's also what's being used by many of these, let's just call them technology-based mental health services, or ones that are more, shall we say, based ideally in using the tech bro approach.
I think for sure to understand that there are definitely supposed to be some safeguards and things within our field. And that's partially why the licensure and governing bodies are so important, and why some aspects of fields that don't have that, like an ethics board to answer to, are a lot of times questionable. And at the same time, there are so many ancestral healing practices and shamans and people that do not have that kind of ethics board and have been utilized for thousands of years,
Mm-hmm.
way before this type of healing practices have existed. I think that there's a myth also, this idea that everyone needs therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's so many different healing ways to go, like modalities and ways to go about being in this world. And sometimes this idea that, there's this one size fits all.
Universality that some just like to try and push.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely a myth. There's so many myths, including that there's so much harmony within the field.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. Well, as you mentioned earlier, the hierarchical nature of some, because I know
Absolutely.
I used to be a part of an organization, I'm not going to name it, that I left, and I have no interest of ever going back to, just because of how they handle that hierarchy nature.
Absolutely. And there's ideas about professionalism.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of that is also sometimes very much that lateral violence of,
Mm-hmm.
putting each other down in
Mm-hmm.
certain ways. And it's very much these internalized stigmas
Mm-hmm.
about what is professional. And I mean, the last time we were together, I was in cosplay.
Right. Which is why immediately when I first saw it, it's like I started like, who is this? Then it's like, oh, I realized it was you, because and the brain wasn't connecting with the heat that we were having down there.
Do you know how many of our colleagues have told me that they don't actually know what I look like? And because every time they see me, I'm in cosplay. So, I mean, there are so many different components to that. But then there's also, hey, how many play therapists are in our field? How many wonderfully creative, artistic, right? And art therapy, right? How many wonderful, expressive people exist in our field? And why is that not honored? In so many ways.
Or because it doesn't also fit within the rating system. And there are those who use the rating system to say, oh, you're going to have a good fit with this between you and this client, or you and this therapist. And no, just because you got a good rating doesn't mean you're the right fit, depending on the problem and the personality.
Absolutely. And, that goes with degrees too.
Mm-hmm.
So someone has, I don't know, let's say a social work degree. And so someone might in their mind think, well, that's not what I need. Or, oh, this person has a marriage and family therapy degree. I'm not married, so that's not what I need.
Right.
And that honestly could be a wonderful fit for you in so many ways. And so sometimes exploring is wonderful. And I think one of the people that I consider an elder in the field actually has an MD, Irvin Yalom. And one of the things that he has said is he'll spend a year with one therapist and then he'll switch. And so I think that's such a interesting and wonderful way to try different flavors and try different paths and explorative modalities of, what could this even look like? What are the possibilities? And I think, his teachings are so great in a lot of ways. And he's not the only person to learn from in our world. Right?
Which is, and that for that, especially with those on the professional side, and even for the client side, it's like there's a reason why sometimes you're not supposed to stay with the same therapist forever. Sometimes you need to be able to move on to another one just because you're getting a new perspective.
Or that if, going into therapy, that means that there's something wrong with you or that you're going to be there forever. Because a lot of it is actually working our way out of a job.
Yes.
It's like, okay. Or that a lot of times there's this understanding that the therapist is there to give you advice
Mm-hmm.
or to tell you what to do. And sometimes our job is to encourage you to find what feels best for you.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And to learn that you had it all along.
Yep.
Which almost sounds mystical or vague as to like what therapy is. But I also think that better portrayals of mental health and, this understanding that mental health doesn't necessarily mean mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
And that there's so many different intersections of different kinds of wellness.
Mm-hmm.
And some people have a therapist that has, for instance, a background in divinity or different other forms of healing practices that can be very, very wonderful and awesome to explore.
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's also a big truth, and this myth that therapy is only talk therapy.
Right. Like EMDR, brain spotting, art therapy, dance therapy, movement therapy.
Mm-hmm.
There's many other forms to it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think there's also this huge myth that we have it all put together all the time.
We're not supposed to share that secret.
Your therapist is not a person. Absolutely. They don't have interests. They don't have lives outside of the session room.
Yes, we just live in our offices.
That's why the couch is there. There's actually a pull-out.
Well, I think that's a perfect place for us to wrap up. So where can folks find you if they want to talk more?
Sure, yeah. I work in a group private practice on the south side of Chicago called Maricare Neurobehavioral Health. And I am also on the Orchid Exchange. And I have an Instagram that's not really like a professional Instagram. It's
well, why don't you just make sure I got the professional ones.
Yeah, so people can definitely message me on Orchid, and we do have a phone number, office phone number for America. And yes, I love meeting and working with people for a variety of different projects and fun things. And I have really enjoyed this talk with you today.
Likewise.
Yeah, it's been great.
The fact that I do know what you look like, since thanks to these conference calls, it was seeing you in cosplay that was kind of the switch.
Oh, I guess so. Yeah, because we have met on Zoom before.
Exactly.
Yes. And I mean, I very, very much appreciate this. I know that we both have had a long day of training and patience and our clients, and you've had other interviews, and for us to keep on keeping on for the causes and the values that we have. And it's just so lovely to be with another kindred spirit. And
likewise.
Yeah, I love this podcast that you're doing. And it's just so great that we're also continuing the magic of San Diego Comiccon and other spaces and others. And although we didn't talk very much about it, it's definitely a sensory overload.
We'll have to have a part 2.
Yeah, right.
Because since you've also spoken at WonderCon and C2E2, it's like it'll be interesting to hear a comparison of all three. from someone who's been to all of them. So maybe that's a part 2.
I would say my favorite con, and this is, for different convention reasons, is Dragon Con, because that's
okay, so we got 4 different cons to talk about as you've been to them. So that's a part 2, folks. I'll let you know when we got that. I'll let you know when we got that part 2 set up. So thank you again, Elizabeth, and I hope you have a good night. And I hope everyone who's listening has a good night as well. And tune in for our next ones here on Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist, and this is on the Voice of America Network. Have a good night, folks.
Thank you for tuning in for Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. Be sure to join your host, Perry Clark, for another episode on the podcast coming soon on the Voice America Empowerment Channel.